Hello everyone. Razorblade Mango here. And today I am here to talk about one of the major pillars of my channel, which is PlayStation. So, as you all know, today is PlayStation's 30th anniversary. And man, they burst on the scene December 3rd, 1994. And here we are, 30 years later, and they are still going strong. They've definitely changed in both, I would say, good and mainly bad ways compared to what they once were when I was growing up. I mean, hell, even in my 20s, I would say they've changed significantly compared to when I was in my early 20s, but we're not here to talk about that today, because I can understand if somebody comes to this channel for the first time through one of my PlayStation videos that I've been making over the last few years, talking about some of the really stupid decisions they've been doing, and they kind of look at how I talk about them and think to themselves, wow, this guy must really hate PlayStation. He must, look at PlayStation and just see red. But that couldn't be further from the truth, because the reason I'm so harsh on PlayStation these days, the reason I just bash them whenever I feel like they're doing something stupid, is because compared to a lot of other publishers out there, I couldn't give less of a shit if a company like EA were to go out of business tomorrow, or if Ubisoft were to go out of business tomorrow, or Activision were to go out. Well, now they're under Xbox, I wouldn't care, but compared to a lot of other companies out there, I care about PlayStation and its history and its legacy way more compared to the average video game company out there. And PlayStation is one of the very rare companies, along with probably Square Enix or I'm trying to think of another one, but it's probably mainly just Square Enix, PlayStation, where it's difficult to untangle my emotional investment in them that I've made over a number of years, where I think PlayStation has been with me throughout my entire gaming history, even before I even owned a PlayStation 2 myself. PlayStation was a presence in my life through, family members or just friends generally that had a PlayStation or a PlayStation 2. So the point of this video today is just to kind of talk about PlayStation and my history with them, and just, I don't know, just take a nice trip down memory lane, because to be honest, I initially wasn't going to do any kind of video for PlayStation's 30th anniversary, but I woke up this morning I'll be honest, in a relatively bad mood, because I didn't really get a lot of sleep last night at the time of recording this, but I saw that video from PlayStation that they put up this morning, where it was that short little 2-minute montage. And normally I roll my eyes and go, ugh, when I see a publisher, kind of self-evangelizing themselves and being like, look how great we are. But I found that video that they put up to actually be kind of nice in a way, because they made it, it's it's about you guys, the players, thank you for being with us. It really didn't smack of look how great we are. It was more like, hey, these are the games that clearly mean the most to you guys. And there were some surprising additions to that video that I didn't think PlayStation would actually acknowledge, like Resistance, or Twisted Metal, or Little Big Planet, or Parappa the Rapper. I was really surprised to see some of those, because I kind of thought the worst when it began with Horizon. I went, oh god, we're pushing Horizon to the front again. But I actually quite liked that video, and it inspired me to come here and sit down and just start talking about PlayStation. So I wanted to start by saying that I think PlayStation entered my life around probably when I was about 5 years old, when I can remember probably the very first video game I ever played that I could consciously remember was Spyro the Dragon. I was at my aunt's house one day, and my cousin had on Spyro the Dragon and Crash Bandicoot as well. So it was those two that I can distinctly remember playing the opening level of Crash Bandicoot, Insanity Beach, and playing through a level of Spyro, and I don't remember exactly what it was. But what I remember is the feeling of like, wow, this is really cool. This looks like a lot of fun. But PlayStation started to creep more and more into my life because I started to see things, more exposure to things like Spyro and Crash Bandicoot and Gran Turismo and stuff like that I would see. And when the PlayStation 2 came out, or Final Fantasy 7, obviously, duh, I saw that as well. But PlayStation 2, when that first came out, that was a big deal. And the thing that you guys have to understand about Middle East, especially in Middle Eastern families, and I've joked about this a lot with people, is that I feel like a lot of young Middle Eastern kids that, were around that time, they either had a PlayStation 2 or a Game Boy Advance, or both, if you came from a well-off family. And I've made the joke that basically I feel like a lot of young Middle Eastern men come out the womb with a dual shock wrapped around them, because that was the thing in my Middle Eastern family at the time, is that on my dad's side, where a lot of my cousins on my dad's side of the family, they had PlayStation 2s, or they had Game Boy Advances, or Game Boy Colors, or they had both. And I can distinctly remember my cousins having games like GTA 3 and like some of the old sports games and stuff like that. But I didn't get a PlayStation 2 until I was about 8 years old. And this is when my dad took me to Toys R Us one night. And I remember we got the fat chonker model of the PlayStation 2. And it didn't come with a copy, but my dad bought me a copy of Batman Vengeance, which I haven't played that game in a very, very long time. So I don't exactly know how well it would hold up in my standards now, but at the time I thought that game was just a lot of fun, even if I was terrible at it. But the interesting thing about the PS2 that I had back then is that I didn't understand the concept of a memory card. And for whatever reason, my dad never bought me a memory card. So if I ever got a game, I basically would finish it in almost a single setting, or I wouldn't turn off the console and just, leave it on overnight and then come in the next morning and finish it. Like I've finished stuff like Resident Evil 4 in one sitting. I finished Spider-Man 2, the video game, in one sitting. I finished the Hulk movie tie-in game that came out in one sitting. I finished Silent Hill 3 in one sitting when I was a kid. The interesting thing, too, about the PlayStation 2 that I had growing up is that what I didn't understand at the time is that I don't know how he did it, but one of my cousins made it a region-free PS2. So my dad would often go to Pakistan, and whenever he would come back, the only thing that I really cared about when he would come back from Pakistan was that he would bring this big sleeve book of bootleg pirated video game discs, which that is something that was a big thing in Pakistan. I don't know how big it is now, but in Pakistan, you could get a lot of games for cheap at the time, PS2 games, because PlayStation was a big presence in Pakistan back then. It still is today, but I'm talking like the heyday of the PS2. It was big. So my dad would come home with all these discs, and I can distinctly remember I got games like Simpsons Hit and Run. I got games like Simpsons Skateboarding. This is also where I played games like Grand Theft Auto 3. I played the NBA Streets Volume 2. With that in mind, for reasons that I've gone over in other videos, that was not a particularly happy point in my life, my childhood with my dad. But the thing that I am very grateful to PlayStation for at the time was that the PS2 for me was a very strong comfort source. For whatever was going on in my life at that time, I could always go to the PlayStation 2 and just kind of get lost in it for a while. Just forget about anything else. And then, of course, this is when, as the years went on with the fat PS2, this is when I would start playing things like Final Fantasy X. I would play things like Resident Evil. And the thing about my dad, too, is that my dad and my mom are very different when it came to the kind of content that I could watch and play growing up. Whereas my mom was very strict at the time about what I watched and what I played, my dad could not have given less of a shit. I think as long as I hid some of the more, like, the things with more, like, foul language and sex at the time, for some reason, he was fine with violence. Like that was fine. Just people getting mowed down. Like, he didn't give a shit that I would go around in GTA 3 and beat hookers to death with a baseball bat. Couldn't give less of a shit. But if he heard a line about like fucking or like some nudity at the time or something like that, I think that would bother him a lot more, which is very weird. But compared to my mom, my dad couldn't give less of a shit about what I was playing. So this is why I was exposed to a lot of mature stuff at that age. So, but in a way, like, I enjoyed the PlayStation 2 so much because it was kind of like my gateway into a more adult world. Seeing, oh, this is what adults can play. This is what teenagers can play. And this is so cool. But the older I got, eventually I had to get my own, the slim model for the PS2, when I was at, when I'm at home, my mom's place. And that was when I had to rebuild my collection at this point, because that PS2, the slim, actually, I still have it. That ain't a region-free one. So I basically had to rebuild my collection again. And this is when I started to get things like Writing Out of Stories, which I've talked about many times on the channel, which is one of my all-time favorite games. This is when I had to rebuy a copy of Resident Evil 4. This is when I had to get things like Medal of Honor Frontline, which I love. I had to rebuy Simpsons Hit and Run, which is a game that, to this very day, I still love Simpsons Hit and Run. I really wish they would remaster that at some point. And this is also when I got things like Kingdom Hearts 2, which is, to this day, is probably my favorite game ever. From the era of when I was 6 to when I was about, maybe like 13, 14, is when I was at like maximum all in or nothing PlayStation mode for me when I was a kid. And what's so interesting about it too is that there was a time where I really fell off the PlayStation wagon, and it was at the beginning of the PS3 era, because for those who know, the beginning of the PS3 was a disaster for PlayStation, where they came out and they were charging like $500, $600 for that console, which was outrageous at the time. I mean, now it's the norm for a console to come out and be like, oh, $500, $600. I mean, fuck, they had a $700 PS5 Pro that came out this year. I mean, holy shit. So we're way past the point where a $500, $600 console is considered outrageous. Now it's kind of like the norm, unfortunately. But at the time when the PS3 was being announced and hyped up, I had always intended to get one because, you know, I saw things like, oh, they're making this game called Resistance. That looks cool. They're making Layer, which looks cool. Oh, they have this Uncharted game, which looks interesting, like Dude Raider. But then they announced the price, and even as a 13-year-old kid who probably could have gotten one if I tugged my mom's sleeve a little harder to get one, even I at that point looked at that price and went, fuck that. Like, I went, no, I am not getting this console. This ain't happening. And for the time between like 2006 and 2010, I still had bought PS2 games like Kingdom Hearts 2, God of War 2. I love God of War 2 so much. But I did not buy a PS3 for many years. So initially things like Resistance, Uncharted, Little Big Planet, all that stuff passed by me because I didn't have a PS3. And that was when I was in my big Xbox 360 era, where I never owned an Xbox 360 during that time, but that was what my friends predominantly played on because Xbox 360 was the king of the console space at that time. I mean, if you had a choice at the time between a 360 and a PS3, you'd be stupid to get a PS3 over a 360. Even if you had to pay for online with 360, you had things like Halo, Gears, Crackdown, Rainbow Six, Elder Scrolls. I mean, the list was huge. And I, despite how I feel about them now, I have a lot of fond memories of the Xbox era from 2006 to 2010, where I would go to one of my friends' houses after school and play Halo or Gears, or we'd fuck around in Fallout 3 or Elder Scrolls 4. Like, I loved that era, even if PlayStation was not a big prominent force in my life. But it was around like 2009 when I started to go, okay, let's get serious about getting a PS3, because the big game that was going to come out the next year was God of War 3. And after playing God of War 1 and God of War 2 and loving those, I went and God of War 3. I needed to see how this trilogy was going to go. And I didn't want to watch YouTube video with a run. I wanted to play it myself. To me, God of War 3 was a system seller. So, I had time to save up. And what would happen is my mom would end up giving me $5 for lunch when I would go to school. This became a thing for like a number of months during 2009. For a long time, for about like 9 to 10 months, until I finally got a PS3 in February of 2010, I didn't eat lunch at school. I took that $5. I told my mom that I spent it and went, oh yeah, I had lunch today. Nope, that was a lie. Didn't have lunch. I went to the ATM after school, put that $5 in to my savings account, and that was that. I didn't eat lunch at school for a number of weeks because I spent that time saving up for the PS3, which at that time, I believe it was about, for the slimmer model, it was about $250, $300, maybe a little bit less than that. But I'm gonna take a wild guess and say it was about $300 at that time. So I had time to save up for a $300 console. And finally, when the day came in February of 2010, I got my PS3 at Target, and the next day I went and at GameStop I got a copy of Grand Theft Auto 4. Now, if you can remember, at that time, my mom back in the day was very strict about what I played and watched. Now, cut to all these years later, as a 16-year-old kid getting a PS3, The guy at GameStop, when I got Grand Theft Auto 4 for PS3, tried telling my mom, oh, are you sure you want him to play this? This is very violent and whatnot. And my mom couldn't give less of a shit at that time. My mom was like, just sell him the damn game. Like, it's fine. I don't care anymore. Because what was funny is one of my favorite memories of the PS2 days is when my mom got me the trilogy box set for Grand Theft Auto. I think it was for my 13th or 14th birthday, because I think she kind of realized at that point that I was already playing mature rated games at my friends' houses. She could not stop this at this point. So rather than trying to fight me on it or try to impose like weird restrictions like, oh, you can't play that game at this person's house, she basically just accepted that this was a losing cause and just went, fine. But, you know, just play it at home. It's fine. So I think it was for my 14th birthday, she got me the box set that had GTA 3, Vice City, and San Andreas. And I already had these games. I'd already played all three of these games at this point. I think I'd already secretly owned a copy of Vice City at this point. Yeah, I already owned a copy of Vice City at this point. But I found that to be a very, like, heartwarming gift, because it was kind of like an acceptance that is like, hey, you're old enough to handle this, you're fine, you're 14, whatever, it's fine. And I love that. And even though one of the games doesn't even work anymore, I think GTA 3 is just fucked. Like, that disc is fucked on the PS2 version, but I still have that collection as kind of like a reminder of like, oh yeah, this is when my mom finally, you know, realized like, oh, just let him play these games. So a month later, after I got the PS3, that was when God of War 3 came out. And I remember staying up all night to play God of War 3. And I loved it. Loved God of War 3. I still have mixed feelings about the final act, but most of that game, loved it. And for the next 3 years, I basically just stuck with PS3. Like, sure, whenever I went to my friends' houses, it would be Xbox 360. But this was also during a time where PlayStation was starting to really get their act together with the games they were making. And they would just start consistently putting out banger after banger after banger each year. And it got to a point where a lot of new games for the 360, like, people really didn't start to vibe with them. And the shift, in a way, started to go more in PlayStation's favor, where you compare it to how it was at the beginning of the PS3 generation, and it was just a shit show, versus how they were at the very end, like the last 3 to 4 years. And what was interesting at the time is that having a PlayStation 3, even in 2010, was seen as the less cool console among my friends. I got a lot of shit from people at the time at my high school that were like, why are you buying a PS3? Like, what are you doing? Why don't you buy a 360 like the rest of us? But the game that really started to get people to kind of, I guess, come crawling back to me to play the PS3 was The Last of Us. And that was around the time when the PS4 was starting to get hyped up, where you had the legendary E3 2013 presentation, which just knocked Xbox on their ass. But Last of Us was such a big thing at that time for PlayStation gamers. That was kind of like the final big swan song for the PS3. And I remember friends messaging me and being like, hey, can I borrow your PS3 to play The Last of Us? And I would just be going, no. It's like, no, I'm not letting you borrow my PS3. Not after the shit you gave me all these years. No, you can go buy a PS3 or a PS4 just like the rest of us and play The Last of Us. So, and then from then on, I didn't get a PS4 at launch, but I got one about 6 months later for my birthday. And I got a copy of Injustice. I remember I had Outlast and Resogun, which is a game I love. I think that's far and away the best PS4 launch game. And from that point, that's when, from this point on, you can kind of chronicle my history with the PlayStation, because this is when I started the channel. And this is when, like, the PS4 was during its heyday, and this is when they started just putting out banger after banger after banger all these years for, like, Bloodborne and Infamous Second Son and Uncharted 4 and Horizon Zero Dawn, God of War 2018, Death Stranding. I mean, the list is just huge for good shit during the PS4 era. Like, we were spoiled during the PS4 era. Now that I have some hindsight after multiple years of the PS5 generation now, we were spoiled. And I've talked about this before, but I think the golden era of PlayStation for me, I feel like they've had two golden eras. They had the golden era during the PS2 days, where I felt like they were really starting to get into their groove of making their own original content. That was awesome. Plus, they had huge support from third-party games, or third-party companies. Like, you had, from their end, you had things like Sly Cooper, Jak and Daxter, Ratchet and Clank, and then from other teams you had, or God of War, of course, you had other teams you had things like GTA, Square Enix making, Final Fantasy, Kingdom Hearts, you had Konami doing Metal Gear Solid 2, 3, and then there was that lull. But then during the PS3 days, it was like the second half of the PS3, all the way up to the second half, or most of the PS4 generation, I felt like that was another golden era for them, where they just went, hey, we can do our big, high-budget games, like God of War 3 and Horizon Zero Dawn and Uncharted, but let's also acknowledge the smaller teams that we have, the smaller, quirkier things that we can do. This is when you had games come out like Journey, Flower, The Last Guardian, Puppeteer, Heavy Rain, stuff like that was just weird and experimental, and I loved that era. Even if the games didn't hit for me, some of them, I appreciated that they tried, which is something they never do these days, which I don't want to say almost never do, because I consider things like Returnal and Astrobot so, like, outside of PlayStation's current wheelhouse that it's like, I'm amazed that they actually allow these games to be made, especially with the fucking Muppets running the show now. But there was a time where I really appreciated their blend of big, high-budget stuff and then weirder, more niche things. I'm harsh on PlayStation because I wish we would get back to that time, but that's a topic for a different video. I've made that video before, but in closing with this, I just want to just give a big thank you to PlayStation, because PlayStation for many years has, like I said, been a source of comfort for me. It was a big part of my childhood. It was a big part of my high school years. It was a big part of my early 20s. PlayStation, it's kind of like died down a little bit the older I've gotten, especially considering the path that they've taken these days, but just for everything that they've done, I'll always be grateful for what they've brought to my life, and the friends I've made because of PlayStation, and the comfort that I used to get out of them. And I mean, even today, like when I went on the PS5 and I saw they added in that PS2 theme that you could select from the temporary theme, which I think is stupid that they're making that temporary, by the way. That should be permanent, because it's an awesome theme. Even then, when I hear the noises of like the PS1 turning on and the sounds, like you're clicking the buttons of the PS2 and the PS3 menu theme, when you hear that, I always still get that rush of serotonin and nostalgia from there. And that to me, it shows me that I still to this very day have very like deep emotional ties to PlayStation's history and culture and legacy and everything. Happy 30th anniversary, PlayStation. And yeah, I'm really curious what they're gonna do next in the future. And come rain or shine, I'll be looking into it and talking about it. So yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you guys next time. See ya.